Good morning, and thank you for joining us this morning. I'm Margaret Anderson from the Old Treasury Building, and I'll be chairing this lecture today as part of our contribution to the celebration of History Month in Victoria. First, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. We thank them for their care of culture and of country, and pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I also welcome our distinguished speaker, Associate Professor Amanda Scardamaglia, who has a real treat in store for us this morning. We asked her to speak today because the 26th of October is International Day of Print, and the printing trade is one of the areas of work we feature in our current exhibition, which is called Lost Jobs, The Changing World of Work. Now, we know that the printing trade changed hugely during the 20th century and in the early years of this century. But Amanda, I think, will show us that the previous century was equally dynamic. But before I introduce Amanda properly, just a few words about the presentation today. I'm sure we're all of us quite used to webinars by now, but just a reminder that for most of the time, you will see only the speaker and her slides on your screen. Your video and sound are both switched off. If you're having any difficulties at all, please use the chat function at the button at the bottom of your screen to report the problem. And Katie, who's in charge behind the scenes, will do her best to sort it out for you. If you have a question, and we do hope that you will, please use the Q&A button. We'll do our best to answer any questions you have, but we may in the end have to take some on notice if we run out of time. As usual, please ensure that your questions or comments are courteous. The lecture should last for about 45 minutes, after which we will have about 10 minutes for questions. Now, I said we were in for a treat this morning, and that is very true. Amanda Scardamaglia is Associate Professor in the Swinburne Law School. Her area of specialty and of legal practice is in intellectual property law, with a special interest in trademark law. And her first book was a study of colonial Australian trademark law. But her PhD led her into some unexpected realms of historical research, specifically to the life and work of a lithographer, Charles Troedel, the man behind much of the branding and advertising of 19th century arts and commerce. We exhibit Troedel's famous Melbourne Album in the Lost Jobs exhibition. In 2020, Amanda published her second book, printed on stone, The Lithographs of Charles Troedel, which was awarded the Victorian Premier's History Award in that year. Now, as she said, 2020 was not the easiest time to launch a new book, but Printed on Stone is a beautifully produced publication, written in a very accessible style, and it deserves to be very successful. If you don't own a copy already, I would urge you to take advantage of the publisher's generous discount offer and buy one at the conclusion of this lecture. Now, Amanda is going to talk to us today about the remarkable life and career of Charles Troedel and about the impact of the lithograph on Australian culture and commerce. Amanda, welcome.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the very kind introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to speak about my book, Printed on Stone, The Lithographs of Charles Troedel, which, as you said, was published in 2020. So I too would like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm presenting and located today, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. So as Margaret said, today I'm going to take you back to the late 19th century and draw on the Charles Troedel archive of advertising lithographs. This archive reveals a really interesting story about how the law, technology, art, and advertising intersect, and in particular about the way that lithography shaped the way print advertising came to be protected by the law and how these print artifacts came to be regulated. But these lithographs also tell a really fascinating story about Melbourne and the Australian colonies more generally, its people, its culture, and its history. And that's what I really want to focus on today, to reflect on this history and the history of our beautiful city, Melbourne. So this is Charles Troedel in a photograph taken in around 1895. Charles Troedel was an award-winning lithographer who brought colour to the lives and homes of Melburnians during the late 19th century, transforming the advertising landscape in the process. He was born Johannes Theodor Karl Troedel on 26 June 1835 in Hamburg, Germany. At age 13, he was apprenticed to his father, Karl Troedel, as a lithographer, and this was really the beginning of his brilliant career as a lithographer. As a young man, Troedel went to work in Norway and London, furthering his craft until 1859, which was the real turning point for him, when he was recruited by a Norwegian printer, Augustus William Shellcraft, who had travelled to Europe looking for talent for his Melbourne business. There was a need for printmakers in the colonies at the time, especially to print maps in Melbourne and Victoria during the gold rush. Lithography was a uniquely European invention, and so Troedel's skills, which he had developed while working throughout Europe, were in high demand. And so Charles Troedel arrived in Melbourne at Williamstown on 5 February 1860 and began working at Shellcraft's wholesale paper bag manufacturing and printing establishment. And Shellcraft at the time was very well known for printing many of Melbourne's early maps. After a few years, though, Troedel left Shellcraft's and he decided to set up his own small print workshop in Melbourne in June 1863. And after importing his own press from Europe, his business, Troedel & Co. Lithographers and Printers, was born. Fun fact, his first small print workshop was located at the time opposite the Argus office and is now the site of the Melbourne Town Hall. So Troedel's first project at this Melbourne Collins Street office at the new workshop was the Melbourne Album, a series of lithographic works depicting views of Melbourne and its surrounding districts. In fact, the first two prints from the album were actually printed at Shellcraft's, but the remaining prints were published at his workshop on Collins Street, which became known as Troedel's Melbourne Album office. So as Margaret said, some of you will be familiar with this compilation, which is currently on display at the Old Treasury building as part of the Lost Jobs exhibition, or you may be familiar with many of the reproductions of the images which have been in circulation ever since. So this print here is one of the first lithographs produced for the album in 1863, Collins Street from Queen Street, which was drawn by Francois Cognier and advertised in the Argus, with a monthly subscription for 2 views to be completed in 12 monthly parts for the price of 7 shillings and 6pence. Collins Street from Queen Street shows the Union Bank of Australia to the right. On the left is the newly built Bank of New South Wales, and into the distance is Scott's Tower, and straight ahead is the now old Treasury building. Francois Cognier produced 12 of the drawings in the 24 plate collection and possibly another 4 which were unmarked. And it was Cognier who had reportedly proposed the idea of a Melbourne-themed album to Troedel during his time at Shellcraft's. Nicolas Chevalier was another contributor to the album, with 2 prints derived from his paintings included in the compilation. Speaking of the Treasury building, here's an image that you may all be familiar with. This lithograph, Treasury Buildings, was based on a drawing by Francois Cognier and was printed at the Melbourne Album office in 1863. The print shows the front exterior of the building in its Italian Renaissance style with Doric columns. At the front of the building, you see some pedestrians milling around some horse-drawn vehicles. The building, of course, was built between 1859 and 1862 and was designed by architect J.J. Clark, who's well known for also designing the city baths, for an estimated cost of around £80,000. Thanks to the success of the Melbourne Album, Troedel's business grew, and for a short period of time, he opened an office in Sydney as well. And it was here that he produced the New South Wales album in 1878 with Richard Wendell. He drew all of the lithographs in this collection, which became the sister compilation to the Melbourne Album. So this is one print from the New South Wales album, Botanical Gardens, Farm Cove, Government House in distance, produced in 1878. You can see a couple picnicking in the gardens. As the title indicates, Government House is into the distance, and the woman's sitting on the lawn while the man is playing with a butterfly net. Now, there's no denying the success of these collectors' compilations, which were reportedly very popular, but Troedel's business endured over the years, for 150 years in fact, because of his great success in commercial printing and advertising. Over the years, the Troedel family were integral to the firm and the business. After Charles's death in 1906, his eldest son, Walter, took over the business. Charles Troedel is shown here in this photograph in the back row, wearing a top hat, and his eldest son, Walter, is shown in the back row, far left, in the bow tie. So after Charles's death, Walter went into partnership with Edward Cooper, who was actually already involved with the business, and the business was renamed Troedel and Cooper. The business was sold and taken over several times thereafter, but even so, the Troedels remained affiliated and associated with the firm, including Walter's son Theodore, his son William, or Bill, and later Bill together with his son Alistair, who were all involved in the business at various stages and in various capacities. And it wasn't until 2013 that the firm went into liquidation, bringing to a close a monumental 150-year run of a printing business bearing the Troedel name and connection. From its earliest days, the firm preserved and archived all of its print jobs, an archive that was donated by Troedel and Cooper, as it then was, to the State Library of Victoria in 1968. The records contained in the archive are the product of the meticulous record keeping of Arthur Hewitt. Hewitt spent his entire career with Troedel and Co. He started at the firm as an office boy in December 1897, and then over the years he was involved in almost all of the administrative aspects of the printing business, holding the role of secretary and director before his retirement. The archive is considered to be one of the most significant printers' archives to survive in a public collection in Australia, and contains almost 10,000 individual print specimens, including product labels, advertising posters, corporate stationery, including company share certificates, Christmas cards, calendars, theatre posters and programs, and other ephemera. The book, Printed on Stone, uses Troedel's lithographs to trace the history of print advertising in Australia across the private and public spheres of society, capturing a diverse cross-section of Troedel's collection in the process. And today I'm going to showcase just some of the collection and the stories behind the images in the archive. Before I do, I want to take a step back and take a moment to talk about lithography. For those of you who've seen the Lost Jobs exhibition, you might already know a little bit about this printing process, but I'll talk you through it now. So lithography is a method of printing based on the incompatibility of oil and water, where ink is transferred to a blank sheet using a press, typically using finely polished limestones. The process of lithography was first discovered by accident by Alois Senefelder sometime around 1796 in Bavaria, with Senefelder then obtaining patents for his printing process in Bavaria and in Europe in the following years. Now, short of a real-life demonstration, the process of lithography is best explained visually. So I've got here for you a step-by-step overview of the process in its primitive form. Obviously, the technology of lithography today is much more sophisticated, but interestingly, most of these methods still rely on the basic principles of Senefelder's process. But if you have a look at the images here, starting from the top left-hand corner of the top row, you'll see that to produce a lithograph, the artist must firstly draw on the surface of a limestone or other plate with greasy crayons. A solution of gum arabic and nitric acid is then washed across the stone, which fixes the grease to the stone. The limestone is then washed with water. Next, the stone is rolled with ink. Here the ink is on the roller. And since grease and water repel each other, the ink adheres to the greasy drawing and not to the clean portions of the stone. Paper is then laid across the stone and pulled through a press, and this transfers the image from the stone to the paper, producing a mirror image of the original drawing. The appeal of lithography was that you could produce multiple prints from this process at a time, and you could produce possibly hundreds of impressions from each stone before the fine detail deteriorated, and the stone would then need to be either replaced or repolished so that it could be used again. The original lithographs were produced using black greasy crayons, but the process evolved very quickly over the following years to use more advanced methods. And the most significant advance in lithography was chromolithography, which allowed for multicolored printing. This would usually involve the use of initial black print on which colors were then layered on top using subsequent stones. Charles Troedel was at the forefront of these advances, and he was recognised as a pioneer in the trade, not just in the Australian colonies, but also internationally. He was awarded a gold medal at the 1881 Melbourne International Exhibition for his work in chromolithography, and in 1883, Troedel was awarded a silver medal at the Calcutta International Exhibition for specimens in lithography. The process of lithography really revolutionised the way that goods were advertised and marketed in the late 19th century. And the Troedel archive of advertising materials found in the home, for items found in the home, really captures this change, especially in the expansive collection of labels and posters used for jams, preserved fruits, teas, and coffees. So the lithograph was responsible for changing print advertising practices around the world, and it certainly had that impact in the Australian colonies. During the latter part of the 19th century, advertising evolved from black and white classified advertising in local newspapers to artistic masterpieces, thanks to lithography, which allowed for the production of low-cost, high-quality illustrations, including colour, for labels and prints like these two here. So on the left is a label for Robert Harper & Co.'s New Season Teas with an image of a paper lantern decorated with cherry blossom and bright floral patterns. And on the right, another label from Robert Harper & Co., printed in the shape of a fan with a lot of intricate detail, as you can see. The label features two workers in traditional dress pulling a copper pot of New Season teas, and a woman is standing at the centre, appearing to direct the two men and the teapot cart while wielding her parasol. Now, lithography wasn't just used for advertising labels or product labels. Lithography also allowed for the reproduction of original paintings, drawings, and other sketches, which were often used as full-page advertisements, but more frequently were used for advertising posters. The advertising poster, like this one here, really owes its existence to lithography and mimics the style of the French poster art movement from the 1880s and 1890s at that time, which of course were all lithographs. So this poster here is a particularly cheeky advertising poster from the collection for Yorick bacon and hams. You can see it's just one example of the really quite detailed production quality that was possible using lithography. You can see the pastel coloured background is dramatically punctuated by the bright red ink that's used for the leading text, but also to brand the featured animals with their fate as hams. Believe it or not, prints like this were not always so popular or cherished. In fact, early lithographs were considered to be cheap, lowbrow, and even vulgar, and sometimes critics described them as pseudoculture. And the owners of these prints were refused protection under the copyright system because they were considered to be ephemeral and commercial in character, and therefore not a legitimate art form. But in time, lithography became much more popular and a preferred means of printing by industry, artists, and government, who all embraced lithography. and it quickly came to dominate graphic design, graphic arts, and the advertising world. And the law eventually came to recognise that these works could and should be protected as artistic works under copyright law, alongside other more traditional artistic mediums such as watercolours, oil on canvas, and portraits. Some of the most elaborate items from the Troedel collection were used for advertising beer, wine, spirits, and tobacco, all the essentials for an afternoon at the bar. So the prints revealed the ingrained and entrenched cultural custom of drinking in Australia at the time, but also the way that alcohol and cigarettes were glamorised in what was then an unregulated market. Prints used for alcohol and tobacco products typically used bright, vibrant colours and reproduced highly detailed illustrations to attract customers. And there wasn't a health warning in sight. Instead, drinking and smoking was considered a civilised pastime and was depicted in that way too. These prints were typically targeting a male audience, with many of these images showing men riding horses as gladiators or playing sport, as we can see here. This print, The Cricketer, which was produced in around 1880, perfectly encapsulates Australia's long history of partnering sports and tobacco before its decoupling in the 1980s. The poster places Australian cricketer Charles Bannerman as the central figure of an advertisement for Cameron Brothers Tobacco, and is a far cry from the plain packages required by law in Australia today. Cricket diehards will know Bannerman represented Australia in Test cricket before becoming an umpire. In this image here, Bannerman is lining up to face the approaching ball on the Melbourne cricket ground. His opposing fieldsmen stand in the distance. The member stand at the MCG is positioned behind the players. The border is rimmed with wattle and eucalyptus trees. And then in each of the corners, cockatoos, possums, emus, kangaroos. A red ribbon spans across the top of the poster bearing the words, "The Cricketer." Now, such is the iconic status of Charles Bannerman, there's no need to mention his name anywhere on this image. He was instantly recognisable, which goes to show Australia's history of worshipping our sporting stars runs very, very deep. When it comes to health and hygiene, the lithographs in this category of the Troedel archive were some of the most stunning, but they also had a tendency to bend the truth. So the 19th century was witness to a growing concern and demand for products to promote health and hygiene. And the result was a flourishing market for medical preparations, pharmaceutical products, soap, combining great design and disinfectant at the same time. You can see here in a label for De Leon's toilet soap made by Rock Thompson and Co. The beautiful bright colours and illustrations for this common soap product, featuring a young girl here on the label with a healthy, rosy complexion. When it comes to pharmaceutical products and medical preparations, here we see some very unscrupulous business practices. These products were often sold as unproven cures and antidotes for almost every ailment known to humankind, and were frequently endorsed by individuals purporting to be medical professionals. So here are some examples for Moulton's Blood Searcher, the Great Blood Purifier, which were promoted with claims to promote health and beauty, pure rich blood, increased flesh and weight, clear skin, and a beautiful complexion. Here's another example of pharmaceutical advertising, this time for Ralph Potts's well-known Magic Balm. The poster was produced circa 1880 and made no attempt to describe the medical or scientific virtues of the product that was being advertised. Instead, the mystical healing properties of this balm took centre stage next to a portrait of Ralph Potts himself. Potts imported Magic Balm into the Australian colonies from New York and sold his elixir through local agents and shopkeepers. He also administered the balm on patients in his dental practice. Potts's foray into dentistry was unconventional. He established a dental practice in Perth and even assigned himself the title of the Dental King, travelling around the colonies accompanied by a brass band. All of this from a man with no dental qualifications. He caught the attention of the dental board and had several charges made against him, but in the end, the board was registered Potts as a dentist, and he went on to have quite a distinguished career. In his obituary, Potts was remembered for the unusual way he introduced himself as a dentist to the people of Australia. And I quote, "From a flare-lighted platform, he employed girls to run along the planks and sell his magic balm. Then he invited anyone suffering from toothache to step up and have the offending molar painlessly removed for 1 shilling. When it came to fashion and style, Troedel's archive of advertising for clothing and apparel gives us a glimpse into the fashions of the time, which borrowed heavily from Europe. But we also see advertising become more segmented and for the first time directed at women, which was a really significant advance. When it comes to the fashion of the day, you can see from these fashion catalogue extracts, it was all about corsets and crinolines and full bustle skirts. As you can see here, these are catalogues for Craig, Williamson and Thomas. The crinoline and its billowing shape was beautiful, but it was also impractical and it could be incredibly dangerous, with women known to set themselves alight walking past open fireplaces or getting caught up in horse carriages, resulting in serious injury or even death. And then there was the corset. The corset wasn't just an object of fashion. Corsetry idealised the female form into a shape and contour to be admired by men. And the common thread, I think, really binding crinolines and corsets was the way that both garments constricted and constrained the female body into this romanticised form. You just have to look at the pain on this woman's face in the advertising poster for the celebrated Triple E corset and her impossibly thin waist. Manufacturers sought to monopolise this silhouette through the patent system, patenting their corset designs throughout the 19th century. Manufacturers also fiercely defended the brands associated with their corsetry during this period. In fact, there was a disproportionate number of trademark disputes reported during that late period of the 19th century concerning corsets, including several cases involving an American brand, Pretty and Sons, and their WB branded corsets. Chief Justice Way heard one of these cases in the South Australian Supreme Court. He complained about the duration of the court proceedings and the time that it took for him to prepare his written judgment. All in all, the hearing of this trademark dispute lasted 52 days and cost £20,000. It also took the Chief Justice almost 4 hours to deliver his judgment. It's no wonder then that the Chief Justice referred to the case as abominable in his private letters, noting that there must be more money in corsets than in the law, literature, or the gospel. The adoption of the 8-hour day in 1856 gave rise to a number of leisurely pursuits in colonial metropolitan cities. And we see these pastimes come through in the Troedel archive. Our love of sport and the great outdoors has a very long history, and we see it's a prevailing theme throughout the Troedel archive. This poster for the Melbourne Sports Depot, which was produced in around 1885, illustrates some of these sporting interests and Melbourne's early obsession with sport. So this poster, which is sized at around 60 by 43 centimetres, shows a young man in cricket flannels holding a cricket bat, helping a young lady holding a tennis racket and tennis shoes across a small waterfall. The poster advertises guns, bicycles, fishing tackle, other sporting equipment, toys, and parlour games. Into the distance, 2 young boys are jostling with a football between 2 goalposts, while another 2 boys are further afield wearing what appears to be their cricket whites. The theme of play is also evident here in this poster for Foy and Gibson's Toy Fair. But this poster also alludes to our love of shopping, which Melbourne is, of course, renowned for. In fact, one of the themes running through the entire archive is the early manifestations of consumerism, which is starting to emerge in the Australian colonies during this period. Many of you will be familiar with the name Foy and Gibson and its factories. Foy and Gibson was one of Australia's earliest department stores. The store was known for manufacturing many of its own wares, including Manchester, clothing, toys, hardware, furniture, and food, and was eventually sold to David Jones in 1967. Foy and Gibson were also famous for its annual toy fairs, which boasted unprecedentedly low prices. Children could meet Father Christmas at the toy fairs, but it's unlikely that he rode in on an emu holding an akubra cat, as he is in this poster for Foy and Gibson's Xmas Toy Fair and Magic Cave. This poster, I think, really captures everything that is so unique about Christmas time in Australia, which is why I love this poster so much. The heat, the dust, the native flora and fauna that make up the Australian landscape. And then there was the theatre, another pastime which Melburnians in particular were very passionate about. Troedel's archive includes a really significant collection of theatre posters like this and perfectly captures the golden age of theatre and the Troedel family's very unique connection to the theatre scene in Melbourne at this time. Troedel and his family were very keen theatre goers, particularly Walter Troedel, Charles Troedel's eldest son, who I introduced to you before. Newspapers described Walter as charismatic, handsome, and I quote, the best dressed man in Melbourne, which is quite a compliment. There was even a story reported in the newspapers of Walter engaged in an animated exchange with Marie Lloyd, an English musical theatre actress, from the stage box on her opening night at Rickard's Old Opera House in Burke Street. Walter was heavily involved in the production of theatrical posters at the firm, and he became the theatrical representative of Troedel & Co. and was responsible for overseeing the production of most of Melbourne's theatrical printing. This collection, as well as being incredibly stunning, is also really significant in the way that it highlights Troedel's very proud history of employing talented apprentices and talented artists in his art department. Some of those names include Charles Turner, William Blamire Young, and most famously, Arthur Streeton, who worked for Charles Troedel as his apprentice. Now, unfortunately, I haven't been able to identify any of the works that Streeton produced at Troedel's workshop before Streeton was then discovered and went on to become part of the Heidelberg School and the Impressionist movement. But this isn't surprising because most of the prints in the archive were not actually signed off by the artist responsible for the drawing, so it's difficult to identify the artist responsible. But there is documentation that Arthur Streeton had very fond memories of his time working with Charles Troedel. In a letter from Arthur Streeton to Walter Troedel in 1937, Arthur Streeton wrote, "Dear Walter Troedel, thank you very much for your kind note of congratulations on what was his knighthood. The honour is for the art of Australia as well as for me. I have often thought of the original old firm of your father's in Collins Street and of how kind he was to me. I did my first 2 or 3 good pictures during Saturday afternoons and Sundays when I was one of his apprentices. With best wishes, yours sincerely, Arthur Streeton." This collection of theatre posters here that I'm showing you also features the mastery of Richard Wendell. So these theatre posters, all of the ones that I've shown you here, were actually attributed to Richard Wendell, and he did sign these posters. So you'll recall that Richard Wendell produced all of the drawings in the New South Wales album, which I had mentioned earlier. Troedel and Wendell go right back. So Richard Wendell actually came to Australia alongside Troedel in 1860. They were both recruited together and they worked together at Shellcrafts. Then they worked on the New South Wales album and they continue to have a long and rich professional relationship. And you can see just how amazing some of these illustrations and the artwork is, with Wendell producing the artwork for almost all of the theatre posters that were manufactured and produced by the firm. Here's another example, another theatre poster, again, also drawn by Richard Wendell, this time for the production Bad Lads Comedy Farce, which was produced in around 1886. Bad Lads was the inaugural production of the New Alexandra Theatre in Melbourne on 1 October 1886, which had been named Alexandra after the then Princess of Wales, but which later became Her Majesty's Theatre. The poster shows scenes from the play, a comedy about married men trying to recapture the fun and freedom of their bachelor days. Sounds familiar? It's a theme rehashed in theatre, film, and literature ever since. So as we've seen, the images in the Troedel archive cover a diverse range of subject matter. Most of the prints are fun and frivolous and really speak to the Australian character and our larrikinism. But underlying some of the prints are some more sensitive and serious themes, at least to modern eyes as we look back on these images now. The glamorization of alcohol and cigarettes, unproven cures from people claiming to be medical experts targeting vulnerable customers, advertising that peddles impossible beauty standards for women, men behaving badly in sellout stage performances to standing ovations. There's a startling familiarity to these themes. On the one hand, Troedel's lithographs represent a period of intense transformation in advertising aesthetic and design practice. And so much of that change is really owed to Charles Troedel and his business at the time. But these prints also foreshadowed what was to come in print and across the new mediums of communication in the 20th and 21st century. So to use a well-worn history cliche, this book and the prints in it that I've shown you today is as much a preface of Australian advertising as it is a history printed on stone. So I'll wrap up there. Before I do, I just wanted to say thanks to the State Library of Victoria, which supported the research for this project and this book through a State Library Victoria Creative Fellowship and made it possible to get access to the archive. But I'd also like to thank the Troedel family who've supported this research over the years, providing lots of enthusiasm, support, and also guidance on some of the fact checking as well. And finally, as Margaret said, the book is available. You can purchase it in store, but also directly from the publisher. And if you use the Print20 code at checkout, you can save $10.
Amanda, thank you. That was a really lovely lecture. Terrific. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now, a reminder that if you have questions for Amanda, and I'm going to try my best to keep my finger on the button so I can't miss them, just type them into the Q&A button that you'll see at the bottom on my screen. It's on the right-hand side, but yours might be different, and we'll do our best to get through them. We have about 15 minutes or so for questions. So maybe while everybody's thinking, Amanda, I might just ask a really easy one, or maybe it's a really hard one. Maybe it's a really hard one. You mentioned that Arthur Streeton referred to Charles Troedel as a really kind man. What do we know about him as a man?
Yeah, so we know a lot. It's interesting. I focused very much on a corporate history of the firm, but it was very hard to look at the history of the firm without also understanding the kind of man that Charles Troedel was. So he was remembered as very kind, very giving, very supportive, and really was considered the grandfather of lithography. So within the community in Australia, he was known to share his craft and skill, to share his expertise with others and really develop others and their talent. And so he was very much fondly remembered for how giving he was in terms of advancing lithography and supporting others. But the firm was also renowned for being like a family. He treated the firm like a family and the people like a family. So there's reports at the time of their famous Christmas parties, the staff giving Mrs. Troedel a bracelet as a gift of thanks at the Christmas party. And that he treated the staff very much as it was a family business, but the staff were part of that as well. So, I feel like there's almost a whole nother story there about the kind of person that he was. He had lots of very influential friends and had a great circle of friends, but was also, as I said, very well known for being a great mentor to others as well in advancing the art and craft of lithography in Australia too.
So not at all the sort of cutthroat world of advertising that maybe we've come to associate with American practice or something in the 20th century. It sounds quite different from that.
It might have been the Mad Men era, probably in the next century. I think that's right. But a very, very different era. And yes, only positive things people had to say about him, which is, as you say, very different to the kind of art departments I suspect that people are working in today.
Yes, indeed. Now we have a question from Max who asks, can you say a little bit more about the last days of the company?
So the firm, I think in the last few years was bought and sold by several other big organisations. So the Troedels at that point had really kind of stepped back. They're still involved in printing in various ways, in different ways, but yeah, I think like a lot of businesses, we know what's happened in Australia with manufacturing and the increase of people looking overseas to get access to cheaper printing services as well. So yeah, the last few years, I don't have the full details, but definitely that it was bought and sold out by a number of big corporations, and eventually it was wrapped up in 2013. But like I said, the Troedels are still very much involved in printing, not involved in the firm as it then was, but I think it runs in their blood. So they're still very much involved in the printing trade.
Yeah, interesting. I must confess, I wondered too, although this is not the period of your book at all, I wondered a little bit about the fact that the company kept the Troedel name right through the Great War, with no apparent attempt to anglicise the name. And I wondered whether they encountered any of the really terrible anti-German prejudice that there was at that time, whether that was part of their experience or whether they'd been around for so long that people had forgotten how they spelled it.
That's a great question. Which you've also answered, because I stopped really at the turn of the century. I haven't looked at the rest of the archive, and I didn't go much further than the sort of 1900, 1905. But you're right. I mean, the firm by that stage had, I think, a very well-established brand. Some of those images are available from that period online. They've been digitized or they're in the archive. They did produce some posters encouraging people to support the war effort. And to join up to the army. So it'd be actually a really interesting exercise to have a look at that, but I didn't delve that much further. But I think it might be you've given me an idea, Margaret.
It would be an interesting thesis topic, wouldn't it?
It would.
Yes. And of course, there were many German families, including some who were interned. There were terrible stories of some who were interned. where the sons were actually fighting on the Allied as part of the Allied forces. So it was no guarantee. Now we have another question from Val, who's saying, my brain is still trying to come to terms with the thought of all those massive stones and their storage. What happened to them?
Great question. So you're right. These are very big machines and very big stones. So the original press is, it was donated again by the firm by Troedel and Cooper. So they donated all of those, the prints from the archive, but they also donated the original press. And that's currently sitting in a basement in storage at the Melbourne Museum.
There's a thought.
There's a thought. And so, I've heard that it was difficult to donate because of the size, because actually finding a space for storage is was quite difficult. But you're right. I mean, the stones were very, very heavy. I mean, this whole process required quite a production. It wasn't just about the space either. It was about making sure that the temperature in the room was right, because that obviously impacted the paper. It impacted the nature of the stone and how it would absorb the ink and those sorts of things. So yes, it required a lot of it was a really highly technical sort of production setup, if you think about it.
And you mentioned somewhere in the book, I think, that the company also produced some stamps at some point. And so, I mean, the security around that is huge, isn't it?
Yeah, and there were actually some reports in the newspapers at the time about counterfeits. And so people were producing counterfeit invoices, stamps and things, and had, the Troedel and Co name on the bottom of it as well. So they really printed across the board. They printed government material, in fact, as well, corporate invoices and stationery, stamps, even some election material and promotional material and things as well. So at the time, of course, remember in the 19th century, you needed to register and get a license to be able to print, to show that you were, you could be trusted to print material, because the governments, of course, were really worried about things like propaganda. And so they clearly passed that test, and they got their license in I think that it was 1878, which was when they were required to be registered, because there was this growing concern. All of a sudden now anyone could get a printer and you could start printing material, and that would mean people would get access to information. So they were, I guess to your question before as well, they were clearly reputed and well regarded in that sense.
And incidentally, Ruth Levison's just popped a little note in here to say that Museums Victoria also has some of the stones.
Amazing.
The printer. Yeah. So there's a thought, Ruth. Lovely to know what's on them and whether they could ever be resurrected and work.
Amazing.
Amanda, at one point you talk about in your book, you use the descriptive term of the 19th century as the visual century. And I think it's a really useful term to think about. But can you comment a little bit more on that, and maybe on the way that lithography helped to bring a sort of a visual culture within the reigns of ordinary Victorians who could never have afforded to buy a Streeton or anything else, but could perhaps afford to own a lithographic print?
So that statement about the fact that perhaps an ordinary person might be able to purchase a reproduction, I'm going to read into that you're suggesting that might be a positive thing. At the time, that was the reason why lithography was highly criticised, because it was too accessible, because it allowed for reproductions and there was no exclusivity in the production of these prints. And how dare you produce something that even the masses could afford? But the 19th century was an amazing time. So I talk about the visual century. It was a time when we had a huge number of advances in the production of visual material. We think about photography, lithography, photolithography, chromolithography, all of these sorts of things, which brought the as you say, the ability to produce material and make that really accessible for the masses. But the huge advantage and what was supposed to be the advantage of lithography was also the thing that art critics hated the most about it. And they said that it was vulgar. It wasn't considered an art form. You wouldn't talk about a lithographer or someone working in an art department at a printing firm. They wouldn't have been considered to be, real artists, because real artists painted on canvas. And so there was a real period there where it was a bit of a culture war about what was art and what was commercial art. And that distinction also played out when it came to the way that the law treated these works as well. So I'm an intellectual property lawyer. I write a lot about these things. That was the angle that I really was interested in as well, which I didn't talk a whole lot about today. But the way that the early cases around this looked at advertising posters and said, well, no, that's not an artwork in the traditional form, so we're not going to afford copyright protection there. So there was a period of time where the printers and the people producing these prints were really struggling as to how do we stop other people from reproducing our work, because there were lots of copycats on the market, of course. And eventually it came to be that sort of distinction didn't really matter. And I think anyone working in lithography would understand that it is it's not a pseudo art, or it's not pseudo, and it's not. It's an art form in and of itself. It's a highly technical process. It requires a lot of collaboration between the artist and the printer, and so that's, eventually it's come to be recognised in that way, but it wasn't always.
No, and I suppose the artists who were producing the drawings and things for Troedel were quite happy when they sold. I mean, the likes of Colonial, for example, and they're quite established and respectable artists at the time, weren't they? So,
and then it became mainstream. That's right. And
yeah,
now I don't think anybody would question that. But I think it's like a lot of things of every generation where there is change. We always find ourselves talking about, it was better when we could listen to things on vinyl, or it was better when we could do things the old way. And I'm sure it was probably very much the same kind of sentiment hashing out at that time.
Yeah. And I suppose the printer was always regarded, I suppose, more of a trade too, wasn't it? And so Troedel's own class position, I guess, was interesting. And maybe Max has asked another question, which perhaps is germane to this. He says, do we know where the Troedel family lived in the 19th century? Which suburb or which part of Melbourne, or did they move around?
So I recall in his obituary, it was noted that he had died at his home in Toorak. And then the family was very much around the kind of Hawthorne area as well. So that probably says a lot. But also not surprising, he was, if you think about the sort of the social circles and the company that he kept, that makes a lot of sense as well.
Yes, yeah. Indeed. And of course he was by then, I presume, quite a wealthy man too. So yes. Yes, interesting. I'm going back to some of those lovely posters and labels and things that you showed. You made the point about lots of the assumptions about gender. Class is probably a little bit less obvious, but I'm sure you'd find it if you looked. Less race nowadays in terms of advertising, but it's very much to the fore in the 19th century, isn't it? So can you tell us a little bit more perhaps about the way in which advertising and product branding at that time was working to create perhaps a sense of empire and to promote a sense of whiteness in the years before the White Australia policy?
Yeah, so I talk a little bit about this in the book. I think there was a real, sense of mission to present the colonies, that to adopt themes in a lot of these sorts of labels, to present the colonies as a thriving success and a civilized kind of place, to try and encourage exactly the kind of thing that Charles did, which was jumped on a boat and moved halfway around the world to go to an unknown land with potentially unlimited opportunity. And so they're very much in a lot of the images that you see, the depictions of what they were trying to do was show that the colonies as being this thriving sort of metropolitan place with lots of opportunity, green, lush landscapes, or sometimes a little bit arid, but, you know, really unique, a place of adventure, to really encourage people to come to the colonies, but also to invest as well, and to show it as a great thriving place. But what you see, of course, is that you see a lot of well-dressed people, you know, wearing morning jackets, drinking whiskey and smoking cigars. Those are some of the images, you know, in the prints. But you don't see any depictions of Indigenous Australians. In fact, you know, you don't see that at all. And so it was a really interesting time where a lot of firms were very much, using the printing process and using these sort of their advertising posters as a way to convey that message. Because remember, these firms needed the colonies to be a success. They'd invested a lot of money here as well. And so it was a really interesting time about the way that it definitely pushed and peddled a lot of myths around Australia's settlement. And the notion that this place was, you know, that it was terra nullius. This is very much what was being pushed at the time. And now we look back and we can see things very, very differently. But I think that was a strategic, it was a, perhaps maybe it wasn't strategic, but that's definitely what was happening at the time.
Indeed, absolutely. Maybe just one last question. You're talking about trademarks, and you make the point that almost all of the trademarks were registered by men, but there were some areas where women took out patents or trademarks, and one of those was, not surprisingly, perhaps around corsetry. But of course, there were a lot of impediments for women in business in the 19th century, weren't there? So can you talk a little bit about the women, if you know anything about any of the women who were taking out trademarks, and did that get easier as the 19th century progressed?
No, so look, there's another idea for another project, Margaret. I'm making notes. But I think, no, I mean, one of the resounding, I think, points, if you look at the prints, the people, the artists that were working in the art department, the people who were registering copyright, the people who were registering trademarks, it was a male-dominated environment. Having said that, though, I mean, slightly detouring, there were a number of women that worked at the Troedel firm as well. And in fact, they were a big part of the business. Charles Troedel were responsible for printing almost all of the labels used on fruit cans. So a lot of you will be familiar with the IXL fruit, the labels for the jams and preserves. And so they almost had that entire market where they were producing all of those labels. And it was the women working in the factories who were known for and renowned for hand gluing those labels onto all of the cans. So they actually had a really significant role in building the Troedel empire, I guess, so to speak. And if you have a look at the time, I've reproduced them in the book, some images of the staff photos. So it's a bit like a class photo. You've got the girls' class and the boys' class. And there was a significant number of women that were involved in the business, but it was certainly, you know, doing very particular work, which was, in a way, you know, implied a sense of class and status as well. But yeah, obviously lots of challenges in terms of being able to own and register property as well. But I think that might be that's another project, I think, Margaret.
Indeed.
Yes.
Many possibilities, and with an archive with 10,000 items in it, it ought to be able to bear a few, I'd have thought.
Well, I only looked at a couple of decades too as well, so I haven't even, as we were talking about before, I need to start moving into some of the latter material as well. So there's a lot there to be tapped into. Yeah.
So we can look forward to volume 2.
3 and 4, I think, as well.
Oh my goodness.
Star Wars series. Yes.
Yeah, fantastic. Amanda, thank you so much. We are just about completely out of time. It was a wonderful lecture. Thank you. Thank you to all of those who asked questions and gave us information. That's always great. And a reminder that the lecture has been recorded and you'll be sent a link to the recording in a couple of days' time. It will be posted on our YouTube site for the Old Treasury Building, and you'll be able to access it there as often as you like, as they say. Just a final reminder now, I think we can't see the screen again, or perhaps we can, but there is a special offer if you purchase Printed on Stone by Amanda and quote the code that's been given and sent, you'll be able to get a discount on purchase. And it really is a beautiful book. So thank you so much, Amanda. It was lovely chatting today and listening to you. And we look forward to volumes 2, 3, and 4.
Thank you. Just need the time, but thank you so much. I'll be back.